The day Martha Callahan buried her second husband, she made a promise to herself that she intended to keep for the rest of her natural life, and that promise was simple. She would never, under any circumstances, walk down an aisle again. The year was 1878, and the town of Redemption, Texas sat baking under a relentless August sun, the kind of sun that cracked the earth and dried the creek beds and made honest men do dishonest things just to survive. Redemption was a town of about 400 souls, wedged between the Caprock Escarpment to the west and a long stretch of flat, golden grassland to the east. It had one church, two saloons, a general store, a blacksmith, a small schoolhouse that doubled as a meeting hall, and a telegraph office that had only recently been connected to the wider world. The railroad had not yet arrived, though the men at the saloon argued about it every Friday night as if their arguing might lay the tracks themselves. Martha stood at the graveside wearing a black dress that had once belonged to her mother, her chestnut hair pinned tightly beneath a dark bonnet, her green eyes dry. She had used up her tears on Thomas Callahan 2 nights before, when the doctor had come out of the bedroom and shaken his head in that quiet, devastating way that doctors had. Thomas had taken a fever in July, and by the first week of August the fever had taken him. He was her second husband, and he had been a decent man, a farmer who smelled of turned earth and pipe tobacco, and who had never once raised his voice at her or at her daughter Clara, who was 7 years old and standing now beside Martha in a small dress of navy blue, clutching her mother's hand. The preacher said the words, and the dirt went over the pine box, and the people of Redemption offered their condolences with lowered eyes and warm dish suppers left on the porch, and Martha accepted it all with a straight back and a quiet thank you that revealed nothing of the storm inside her. Her first husband, Ned Waverly, had died 5 years before Thomas, kicked by a horse out on the south pasture. She had been 22 then, newly widowed, with no child and very little money and a farm that needed 2 hands to run. Thomas had come along and been kind, and she had been grateful for the kindness, and gratitude had grown into something close enough to love that she had not questioned it. But now Thomas was gone, and she was 29 years old, and she had buried 2 men, and she was finished. She told old Margaret Freeborn as much, the morning after the funeral, over coffee in Margaret's kitchen. "Martha, you are a young woman," Margaret said. She was 63 and had been widowed herself once and had chosen to stay widowed, which was a fact Martha had always admired. You cannot simply decide to live alone. "I can and I have," Martha said, wrapping both hands around the coffee cup. "I am done with it, Margaret. I will raise Clara and I will keep the farm running and I will live a perfectly respectable life without any man in it. You say that now." "I will say it always," Martha said, and she meant it with every bone in her body. And for 3 months she kept to her word with a discipline that impressed even Margaret. She learned to manage the farm accounts herself, squinting over the ledger by lamplight after Clara went to sleep. She hired a farmhand named Eli, a 16-year-old boy from the edge of town whose family needed the money, and she directed him firmly and fairly and never let him think for a moment that she did not know exactly what she was doing. She planted winter wheat in September, haggled at the grain exchange in October, and by November she had patched the roof of the barn herself, standing on the ladder with a hammer and nails while Eli held the rungs below. The people of Redemption watched all of this with a mixture of admiration and concern, and the concern was mostly from the men, who did not quite know what to make of a woman who ran a farm without any apparent need for a husband. It was on a cold Tuesday in November that Harlan Shelby rode into Redemption. He came from the north, on a big roan horse named Copper, with a bedroll behind the saddle and a rifle scabbard on the right side, and a pair of saddlebags that looked like they had seen 300 miles of hard use. He was 34 years old, broad through the shoulders and lean in the hips, with dark brown hair that curled slightly at the collar, and a jaw that had not seen a razor in about 4 days. His eyes were gray, the particular gray of the sky just before a storm rolls in from the west, and they moved with the steady, unhurried attention of a man who had spent years in open country, where missing a detail could cost you everything. He rode straight to the livery stable, arranged for Copper to be fed and watered, then walked to the general store and bought coffee, dried beef, and a new pair of work gloves. He asked the storekeeper, a round-faced man named Gerald Holt, if there were any ranches hiring. Gerald Holt told him there were not at the moment, but that the widow Callahan out on the East Road had been advertising for an experienced farmhand since her last one had gone home to his family for the winter. Harlan Shelby thanked him and went to the widow Callahan's farm. Martha was splitting firewood in the yard when he rode up the dirt track, and she did not stop splitting firewood when he dismounted. She drove the maul down and split a log clean and set both halves aside, and looked at him with the kind of cool assessment she had been practicing for months. "If you are selling something, I do not need it," she said. "I am not selling anything," he said, pulling off his hat. His voice was low and even, with a slight drawl that was more West Texas than anything. "My name is Harlan Shelby. Gerald Holt at the store said you were looking for a hired hand." She looked him over. He was clean enough, despite the road dust. He held his hat with both hands, which suggested manners. He met her eyes without being aggressive about it, which suggested he was neither a bully nor a coward. "What is your experience?" she asked. "Cattle, mostly. 6 years with the Three Rivers outfit up near Amarillo. Before that, 2 years on a farm outside San Antonio. I can shoe a horse, fix a fence, plow a field, repair a wagon, and I'm a reasonably good shot if it comes to predators bothering the livestock." "It comes to that sometimes," she said. "There is a pack of coyotes that has been working the south fence line." "I can handle coyotes," he said. She set the maul against the woodpile and studied him for another moment. "The pay is 60 cents a day and a place to sleep in the barn loft. Sundays off, meals from my kitchen. I set the hours and the tasks, and I do not argue about either." "That sounds fair," he said. "If you drink heavily, I will know it and I will not tolerate it." "I take a whiskey now and then," he said honestly. "I do not take to drinking in a way that makes me stupid or dangerous." Something in his frankness decided her. "All right, Mr. Shelby, put your horse in the paddock. The barn is around back. Loft is clean, there is a lantern, and there are extra blankets in the trunk at the foot of the ladder. Supper is at 6. He nodded, put his hat back on, and went to see to his horse without further ceremony. Martha watched him go with a strictly practical eye. He moved efficiently, without waste. That was what she needed, an efficient hand who would do the work and not trouble her. At 6 o'clock he appeared at the kitchen door, clean-faced, hair combed, hat in hand, and he knocked even though the door was open. "Come in," Martha said, ladling stew into bowls. Clara was already at the table, watching the stranger with the frank, unguarded curiosity of a 7-year-old. "Your horse is very big," she announced. "He is," Harlan agreed, taking the chair Martha indicated with a nod. "His name is Copper on account of his color." "I like horses," Clara said. "My papa had a horse named Fletcher." There was a brief silence, and Martha put the bread on the table and sat down. "Clara, grace." Clara folded her hands and said grace in a small, clear voice, and then they ate. The stew was good, with dried peppers and turnips and a generous hand with the salt, and Harlan ate without theatrics and said it was the best meal he had eaten in 2 weeks, which Martha suspected was true and not flattery. After supper he went back to the barn without being asked, and Martha stood at the kitchen window and watched the lantern light flicker in the loft window and told herself that this was merely practical. She needed someone who could do the heavy work through winter. That was all. In the days that followed, Harlan Shelby proved himself quietly and without fanfare. He patched the south fence before Martha had even mentioned it was a priority. He fixed the water pump that had been squealing for a month. He tracked the coyote pack to a ravine a quarter-mile out and set snares that reduced the threat to the chickens within a week. He did all of this without being asked twice, and he never appeared in the kitchen doorway unless supper was ready, and he never spoke more than was necessary, and Martha found this admirable in a man. Thomas had been a talker, endlessly filling silences with comfortable chatter, and she had loved him for it, but she had also come to realize that the silences themselves were not empty. They were just silences. Harlan seemed to understand that. What she had not anticipated was Clara. Clara attached herself to Harlan Shelby within 4 days of his arrival with the focused determination of a child who has decided a thing is going to happen. She appeared at the barn every afternoon after school, still in her school dress, and sat on the fence or on a hay bale and talked while Harlan worked, and he listened, which was apparently all she required of him. Martha told herself this was fine. Children needed people around them. It was perfectly natural. Then one afternoon in late November, she came outside to call Clara for supper, and found the two of them standing at the paddock fence with Copper's big copper-colored head between them. And Clara was telling Harlan something urgent about a spelling test, and Harlan was listening with his whole attention, the way a man listens when he actually cares, and not just when he is being polite. And Martha felt something move inside her chest that she immediately and firmly suppressed. She called Clara in for supper and told herself she felt nothing. The first real conversation she had with Harlan that was not about the farm happened in early December, on a Saturday afternoon when the temperature dropped sharply, and a gray curtain of clouds moved in from the northwest. Martha was on the porch mending a piece of harness when Harlan came up from the barn with a length of chain that needed a link replaced and sat down on the porch step, not intrusively, just within speaking distance, and worked at the chain with a pair of pliers. They worked in silence for a while, which was comfortable enough. Then Martha said, without particularly planning to, "Where are you from originally, Mr. Shelby?" "Missouri," he said. "Town called Boonville." "My family had a place there. I left when I was 18. "Why?" He worked the pliers around the link. "My father and I did not agree on how things ought to go. He wanted me to stay and take over the family business, which was a hardware store. I wanted open country. We argued about it until it became clear arguing was not going to change either of us, so I left." "Do you regret it?" He considered this with the same unhurried attention he gave everything. "Sometimes," he said. "My mother passed 4 years ago and I was not there for it. That I regret. The rest of it, no." "Have you never wanted to settle somewhere?" she asked. He looked up at her then, and those gray eyes were steady and honest. "I have been looking for the right place," he said. "Have not found it yet." She looked back down at the harness and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that would not lead somewhere she did not intend to go. Over the next several weeks, as December deepened and the cold settled in over the Texas panhandle, the conversations happened more frequently. Not long ones, not intimate ones, just the kind of conversation that develops naturally between two people who share a space and mutual respect. She learned that he had read more books than she expected, that he had strong opinions about the mismanagement of the open-range cattle industry, that he had once briefly considered becoming a lawman before deciding the politics of it were not to his taste. He learned that she was a better mathematician than she gave herself credit for, that she had grown up in Arkansas, that she had come to Texas with her first husband following a dream of land and starting over. Clara, meanwhile, had fully adopted him. She brought him drawings from school. She saved him the heel of the bread loaf, which she had decided was the best part. She told him with complete seriousness one evening at supper that he was her second best friend after her school friend Lucy Crane, and that Lucy Crane had a dog, but a dog was not as good as a horse, so really Harlan was first if you counted Copper. Harlan received this ranking with a straight face and thanked her with appropriate gravity. Martha, watching this from across the table, felt something complicated and unwelcome happening in her chest and deliberately changed the subject to the condition of the winter wheat. It was Margaret Freeborn who named what was happening on a Wednesday afternoon when Martha came to town for supplies and stopped in for coffee. "You have someone living on the farm," Margaret said, not as a question. "A hired hand," Martha said. "Harlan Shelby. He worked the Three Rivers outfit up near Amarillo. Gerald Holt says he is younger than 40 and does not have a wife. Gerald Holt talks too much, Martha said. Martha, Margaret. The two women looked at each other across the kitchen table. I am not looking, Martha said. I know you are not looking, Margaret said. That is generally when you find something. I told you when Thomas died that I was done. I meant it. Intentions are not armor, Margaret said in her practical way. They are just intentions. Martha drove home in the wagon with her supplies and a tight feeling in her jaw and refused to think about it, and managed this successfully until she came up the track and saw the light in the barn, steady and warm against the gray December afternoon, and felt a small, involuntary lift in her heart that she did not know what to do with. Christmas came quietly. Martha bought Clara a rag doll and a book of illustrated fairy tales, and she roasted a chicken and made an apple cake from the last of the dried apples. And she set the table with 3 places without overthinking it, because it would have been strange to make the man eat alone in the barn on Christmas Day. Harlan came to the table with his hair combed and a small package in his hand, which he set on the table near Clara's plate without ceremony. Clara opened it and found a carved wooden horse, small and perfectly proportioned, with careful lines cut for the mane and tail, painted a deep reddish-brown that was unmistakably meant to suggest copper. Clara's face transformed into a radiance that would have softened a stone. "You made this," Martha said quietly, looking at it. "Long winter evenings," he said, sitting down. Martha looked at him for a moment, at the straight honesty in his face, at the fact that he had spent his evenings carving a gift for a 7-year-old girl who was not his own child, and she felt the warm, dangerous thing in her chest expand and push against the wall she had built, and she looked away quickly and said, "Clara, Grace." After supper, with Clara asleep on the settee, Martha poured 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of Harlan without being asked and sat down across from him. Outside, the wind was pushing cold across the panhandle, rattling the window panes. "Harlan," she said, and it was the first time she had used his first name, and she noticed it the same moment he did. "Mrs. Callahan," he said with a very slight shift in his expression that might have been something. "Martha," she said, "if we are doing first names." "Martha," he said, and there was a quality to the way he said it that was careful and warm at the same time. She wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. "I want to say something to you, and I want to say it plainly so there is no misunderstanding." He nodded. "I'm not looking for anything beyond what this arrangement is," she said. "I think you are a good man and a reliable hand, and you have been very kind to my daughter, and I appreciate all of it. But I made a decision after Thomas died, and I have not changed it. I will not remarry. Not for any reason. I want you to know that so that neither of us makes assumptions that would complicate things." She said it directly and without apology because it was her life and her decision and she was not going to hedge it. He held her gaze for a moment and then he said something she had not expected. "Name your reason," he said, "and I will fix it." She stared at him. "I beg your pardon," she said. He was not being glib, she could see that. He was completely serious, those gray eyes level and calm, and there was no arrogance in it, only a kind of quiet certainty. "You said not for any reason," he said. "That is a broad statement. Most things that seem unfixable are not. So name your reason." Martha set her coffee cup down and looked at this man across the table in the lamplight of Christmas night, with the wind at the windows and her daughter asleep on the settee, and felt something between outrage and an entirely unwanted desire to laugh. "It is not a problem to be solved," she said. "Most things are," he said. "Harlan Shelby," she said, "this is the most presumptuous thing any person has said to me in my entire adult life." "I expect it is," he agreed without apology. "I have buried 2 husbands," she said, and the words came out harder than she meant them to. "I watched 2 men that I cared for go into the ground before their time, and I was the one left standing. I'm not doing that again. I am not going through that again. No one can fix that." There was a silence. "No," he said quietly, "that one I cannot fix. You are right." She had expected him to argue, and the lack of argument disarmed her. She picked up her coffee cup and found she had nothing more to say. "But," he said after a moment, "that is a reason born of grief and fear, not a reason born of not caring." "It amounts to the same thing," she said. "Does it?" he said. She did not answer that because she was not sure. He stood up, thanked her for supper and for the Christmas table, and said good night, and went out into the cold. Martha sat alone in the kitchen for a long time after that, listening to the wind, and did not sleep well. January came in with a blue norther that dropped the temperature to something that made the cattle hunker and the horses restless. Harlan managed the livestock with practiced competence, breaking ice on the water troughs each morning before Martha was up, moving the chickens to a sheltered spot behind the barn, reinforcing the gaps in the barn wall that the wind found every winter. He did not bring up the Christmas night conversation again. But something had shifted, and they both knew it, and the knowing of it changed the texture of everything. Martha found herself more aware of him in the yard, the sound of the axe on wood, the shape of him crossing from the barn to the well. She caught herself noticing small things, the way he paused sometimes in the middle of a task and looked at the horizon with a distant, thinking expression, the way his whole face changed when Clara made him laugh, the way he was with Copper, easy and affectionate without being sentimental. She did not like noticing these things. She noticed them anyway. In the middle of January, a man named Cyrus Prout rode through Redemption looking to hire men for a cattle drive heading west toward New Mexico territory. He stopped at Martha's farm, having heard from Gerald Holt that there was a skilled hand working there, and made Harlan an offer of 3 months' work at significantly better wages than Martha was paying. Martha heard this through the barn wall, where she had come to ask about the hay supply, and stopped without announcing herself, which she was not proud of. She heard Harlan say, "I appreciate the offer, Mr. Prout. I am going to decline." She heard Prout say that was a fair amount of money to walk away from. She heard Harlan say, "Yes, it is. There are things that matter more than money." She went back to the house before he came out of the barn and put a pot on for coffee and pretended she had not heard any of it, but it stayed with her, warm and troubling, through the rest of the afternoon. That evening she could not help it. "I heard Mr. Prout's offer," she said when he sat down at the supper table. He looked at her, not embarrassed. "He made a fair offer," he said. "Why did you refuse it?" Clara was looking between them with the alert attention of a child who understood more than adults gave her credit for. "Because I intend to see this place through to spring," he said. "I said I would, and I meant it." Martha nodded and passed the biscuits and did not push further. But when Clara went to bed, she stayed at the kitchen table longer than she needed to. And Harlan stayed too, and they talked about things that had nothing to do with the farm, about whether the railroad was truly coming, about a book she had been reading, about the politics of the cattle barons and the homesteaders, and the injustice of a system that kept finding new ways to push ordinary people off land they had worked and bled for. He felt strongly about this, she discovered, in a way that was informed and considered rather than simply angry, and she found herself arguing alongside him rather than against him, and enjoying it. She thought about what Margaret had said, about intentions not being armor. She pulled the armor tighter and told herself she was fine. February brought a brief thaw and then more cold, and then, on the 14th day of the month, a problem that Martha had not anticipated. A man named Dale Prout, who was Cyrus Prout's younger brother and bore no resemblance to him in either temperament or decency, appeared at Martha's farm claiming that Thomas Callahan had owed his brother money, and that the debt had transferred to the estate, and that he was there to collect. This was not, to the best of Martha's knowledge, true. She knew Thomas's accounts. She had gone over them herself 3 times since his death. There was no debt to anyone named Prout. Dale Prout was a wide, unpleasant man with small eyes, and the look of someone who had spent years deciding which situations were safe to be large in. He was accompanied by 2 men on horseback who stayed at the edge of the yard, which was clearly meant to be intimidating. Martha stood on the porch with her hands folded and her chin level, and said calmly, "Mr. Prout, I am not aware of any such debt, and I would require you to produce documentation before I would consider any claim of that kind. Prout said that the documentation was the word of his brother, which ought to be enough. Martha said it was not. Prout said things could get difficult for a woman alone. Harlan came around the corner of the barn at this point, not dramatically, not running, just walking steadily toward the porch with the particular quality of attention in his gray eyes that made the situation very clear without a single word. He stepped up onto the porch beside Martha and looked at Dale Prout and his two men. "The lady said she requires documentation," Harlan said, in his quiet, even voice. "I think that is a reasonable request. You might consider riding back to town and producing some." There was a long moment of assessment. Dale Prout was not, in the end, the kind of man who pushed a situation when the odds changed. He called Martha a word that made Harlan's jaw tighten visibly, but he left, and his two men left with him, and the dust of their horses settled back on the road. Martha let out a breath. "He has no documentation," Harlan said. "No," Martha agreed. "He does not. Thomas kept careful accounts. I know every cent." "He will probably try it in town next," Harlan said. "With the justice of the peace or whoever he can get an ear with. I can ride in with you when you go to address it." "I can address it myself," she said, which was true but not the point. "I know," he said. "I meant I would go with you, not instead of you." She looked at him. "All right," she said. "Thank you." They rode into Redemption 2 days later, Martha with her ledger and every document Thomas had left, and she presented the accounts to Justice Haverford with a clarity and organization that left nothing open to interpretation. Haverford reviewed the ledger, reviewed the deeds, asked 3 questions that Martha answered without hesitation, and declared that there was no legitimate claim and that any further harassment from Dale Prout would be a matter for the sheriff. Harlan sat in the corner of the justice's office through all of this without saying a word, which was exactly what Martha needed him to do. Afterward they stopped at the general store, and Martha bought flour and salt and a length of blue calico for a dress she had promised Clara, and Gerald Holt looked at them with the barely suppressed interest of a man who considers himself the town's primary information hub. "Nice day for a ride, Mrs. Callahan," Gerald said. "Gerald," Martha said pleasantly, "if you print a single word of speculation in that newsletter of yours, I will take my custom to the dry goods store in the next town." Gerald closed his mouth and weighed her flour. On the ride back, with the winter sky wide and pale above the Texas plain, Harlan said, "You handled that well." "I handle things," she said. "I know," he said. "That is not a small thing." She looked over at him, riding easy on copper, the roan's breath pluming in the cold air. "Most people mean it as a small thing," she said. "When they say a woman handles things, they usually mean they are surprised she is competent." "I do not mean it that way," he said. "I mean it the way I would mean it about any person I respect." She looked at the road ahead. "I know," she said, and she found she did know it, and the knowing of it made her grip her reins a little tighter. March announced itself with wind, and then a slow, steady rain that went on for 4 days and turned the yard to mud and kept everyone close. On the 3rd day of rain, Clara came home from school with a cough that by evening had turned into something more serious, with a fever that made her small forehead hot to the touch. Martha sat up with her through the night, wringing cloths in cool water and coaxing spoonfuls of broth, and trying not to let her fear show on her face because Clara, even sick, was watching her mother's face for information. At some point around 3 in the morning, she heard a sound from the kitchen and went to find Harlan building up the fire, moving quietly. He had come in without being asked, sometime in the night, and put a pot of water to heat and laid out extra blankets from his own bedroll. "How is she?" he asked low. "Fever is high," Martha said. Her voice was steady, but her hands were shaking slightly, and he noticed. "The doctor is coming. I sent Eli for him this evening. He should be here by morning." Harlan looked at her. He did not say the things people said, the hollow reassurances. He said, "Sit down. I will watch the pot. You should drink something." She sat at the kitchen table, and he poured her a cup of hot water with dried rosemary from the bundle hanging in the pantry, which was all there was, and she wrapped her hands around it and sat in the lamplight and let herself be tired for a few minutes while Harlan kept the fire and did not crowd her. After a while she said, "I am frightened." "Yes," he said simply. He did not tell her not to be, he just acknowledged it. "She is all I have," Martha said. "I know," he said. "If something happened to her I do not know what I would do," she said, and her voice cracked slightly at the end of it. Harlan left his spot by the fire and came to the table and sat down across from her, and he reached across and put his hand over hers and he held it and he did not say a word. Just held her hand, steady and warm in the cold, rainy, frightened middle of the night. She let him and did not think about what it meant and just held on. The doctor arrived at first light. He diagnosed the cough as a serious bronchial inflammation, prescribed rest and steam and a tincture of pine resin and honey, and said Clara was young and her constitution was strong and the fever should break within a day or two. He was right. By the afternoon of the following day the fever came down, and Clara, pale and tired, asked for the carved wooden horse and held it against her chest and went asleep with it. Martha stood in the doorway of Clara's room watching her daughter breathe, regular and even, and felt a relief so enormous it left her weak. She leaned her forehead against the door frame and closed her eyes and let it wash over her. Harlan came up behind her, quiet as always, and stood in the hall. "Better," he said. "Better," she said. She turned around and looked at him, and she was still shaking slightly from the release of tension, and without thinking about it at all, she stepped forward and put her forehead against his chest, not in a way that was anything complicated, just in the way a person who has been holding a heavy thing for a long time puts it down for a moment. He went very still, and then his arms came around her carefully, holding her without pressing, and she stood there for a moment in the hallway with Clara's quiet breathing behind her and the rain still falling outside and Harlan Shelby's arms around her, and it was the most simply right thing she had felt in longer than she could easily say. She stepped back after a moment and did not look at him. "Thank you," she said. "For last night." "Yes," he said. She went to make supper, and they did not talk about it. But it had happened, and she knew it had happened, and she lay awake that night listening to the rain taper off into nothing and thought about what it meant to be afraid of something you also wanted. Spring came early, with a warmth that felt like an apology for the winter. The wheat began to push through. The wildflowers arrived on the south meadow, a wash of bluebonnets and Indian paintbrush that Clara ran into with her arms out, her cough fully gone, her color back, the wooden horse tucked into her pinafore pocket. Harlan fixed the paddock fence and the chicken house and the back gate that had been hanging wrong for 2 seasons, and he turned the south field for the spring planting, and he was brown from the sun and looked more settled than he had when he arrived. He looked, Martha thought, with some alarm, like a man who had found a place. She tried to talk herself out of what she felt, which was a project that was not going well. She made lists of reasons in her head, the list she had made for herself the night of Thomas's funeral and kept adding to ever since. She had buried 2 men. She did not want the particular grief of loving someone and watching them go. She had Clara to consider. The farm was hers and she was managing it, and she did not need the complications that came with a man's name attached to any of it. The law was not kind to married women in matters of property. She had built something here alone and she was not going to put it at risk. These were all good reasons. They were legitimate, reasonable, defensible reasons. She was aware that they were also reasons Harlan Shelby had, on Christmas night, offered to fix. She was aware that at least one of them, the property question, was actually fixable, with the right kind of legal arrangement. She had read enough in the Redemption Gazette about the evolving discussion of married women's property rights to know that things were slowly changing, that there were states where a woman's property before marriage remained hers, that a carefully drawn contract could protect what was hers. She pushed this thought aside. She pushed it aside again in April, when the bluebonnets were still up, and the evenings were long and warm, and she and Harlan had taken to sitting on the porch after supper, while Clara played in the yard before bedtime. They talked easily now, the way people talk when they have stopped being careful about it, and once he made her laugh so suddenly and completely that she covered her mouth with her hand, embarrassed by the force of it, and he was looking at her when she looked back at him, and there was something so unguarded and warm in his gray eyes that she looked away quickly and said something about it getting late. It was Margaret who finally said it plainly, on a morning in late April when Martha came to town. "You are in love with him," Margaret said, setting coffee on the table. "Margaret," Martha began. "Do not," Margaret said. "I am 63 years old and I have known you since you arrived in this town, and I am telling you what I can see from across the room. You are in love with that man." Martha was quiet for a moment. "Even if that were true," she said finally, "it does not change my decision." "What is your decision based on now?" Margaret asked. "Because when you first made it, it was based on grief and exhaustion, which was entirely understandable. But what is it based on now?" Martha thought about this seriously because she always thought about things seriously. "Fear," she said after a moment. "Of what specifically?" "Of losing someone again," she said. "Of loving someone that much and then watching them go. I cannot do it again." "You cannot prevent it by refusing to love," Margaret said. "That is not how loss works. You already love that child in your yard. You would grieve her beyond measure if something happened to her. Love does not become safe because you withhold it from certain people." Martha stared at her coffee cup. "And," Margaret said more gently, "have you considered that he might lose you? That fear of loss is not a direction, it is just fear. And that a man who sat up with your sick child in the night and turned down better wages to stay at your side and carves wooden horses in his spare time might be worth the risk of living." Martha drove home slowly, with the spring sun on her face, and thought about everything Margaret had said, and thought about what it meant that her best counterarguments had quietly collapsed. She thought about Harlan's words on Christmas night, sitting across the lamplight table. "Name your reason. I will fix it." She pulled the wagon up the track and saw him in the south field, walking the turned earth, checking the wheat, and he looked up at the sound of the horses and raised a hand in greeting, easy and unhurried. And she felt it again, that warm and terrifying thing, and this time she did not suppress it. She just let it be what it was. That evening, after supper, after Clara was asleep, she poured 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of him and sat down across from him, and she said, "I want to revisit a conversation we had on Christmas night." He looked at her without surprise, as if he had been waiting. "You said to name my reasons and you would fix them," she said. "I told you that the grief of losing people was not fixable." "I agreed that it was not," he said. "You were right that it is not," she said. "But Margaret pointed out to me this morning that I already love my daughter and I would grieve her terribly if I lost her, and refusing to love you does not make my life safer. It just makes it smaller." He was very still. "My other reasons," she said, keeping her voice steady, "were about property and practicality. I have worked this farm alone and I will not have what I have built subsumed into someone else's legal identity." "That is fixable," he said. "Yes," she said. "I know it is. I have read about married women's property acts. Texas has provisions. With the right agreement drafted by a lawyer, my land and my assets would remain mine in legal fact." "Then we draw up that agreement," he said. "Harlan," she said. "Martha," he said. She looked at him across the table, this man with the steady gray eyes and the careful hands and the long patience, who had spent the winter earning her trust not with declarations but with showing up every single morning in the cold without being asked. "I am still frightened," she said. "I know," he said. "I am too." This surprised her. "You are." "Enormously," he said. "I have been trying not to push you because I knew it was not mine to push, and because I have never in my life felt about anyone the way I feel about you, and the idea that I could say the wrong thing and lose it terrifies me more than anything I have faced." "You have never said that before," she said. "You needed time," he said. "Not a speech, time and evidence." She looked down at her hands on the table, then she looked back up at him. "If I say yes," she said, It is going to be a proper legal arrangement with a proper lawyer. My land stays mine. We run this farm together as partners in fact and in practice." "Yes," he said, without hesitation. "And you are choosing this place," she said. "Not passing through. Copper stays in my paddock permanently." The corner of his mouth moved. "Copper has been comfortable in that paddock since November," he said. "He has no interest in leaving." "And you," she said. He reached across the table and laid his hand over hers the same way he had on that cold, rainy, frightened night in the hall, and he said, "Martha, this is the right place. You are the right place. I have been sure of that since about December." She turned her hand over and held his. "All right," she said. "All right," he said, as if he needed to be sure. "Yes," she said, and she found, saying it, that the fear was still there, but it had moved to the back, behind something much larger and much warmer, and she thought perhaps that was how it was supposed to go. Not the absence of fear, but the presence of something stronger. He did not immediately sweep her into a dramatic declaration. He just sat there holding her hand and looking at her as if she were the most important thing he had ever seen, which was more than enough. Then she laughed, softly, partly because she was relieved and partly because she was happy, and it had been a long time since she had been simply happy without qualification. "You are going to have to get proper with Margaret Freeborn," she said. "She will expect to be consulted." "I will consult Margaret Freeborn first thing in the morning," he said seriously, and she laughed again. The proposal, when it came, was not a grand affair in the middle of the town square, because that was not who either of them was. It came a week later, on a morning when the wildflowers were still going strong and Clara was at school and Martha was in the kitchen doing accounts, and Harlan came in from the yard and sat down across from her and said, "I would like to marry you, Martha Callahan, if you will have me. I would like to spend every day of whatever time we have making sure you do not regret it." She set down her pencil. She looked at him. She said, "I will have you, Harlan Shelby." He let out a breath that she realized he had been holding. They told Clara that afternoon when she came home from school. Clara stood in the kitchen doorway in her school dress, looking from one of them to the other with those serious eyes that had never missed anything. "Does that mean Harlan is staying permanently?" she said. "Yes," Martha said. "And copper," Clara said. "And copper," Harlan confirmed. Clara considered this for approximately 2 seconds and then announced that this was the best news and could they have apple cake to celebrate. Martha looked at Harlan over Clara's head, and he was smiling, full and unguarded, and it was the most beautiful thing she had seen in years. They went to see Gerald Holt for the lawyer's name, because Gerald knew everything, and this was one time his extensive networking served a genuine purpose. The lawyer was a man named Albert Morse, who kept an office in the county seat 20 miles east, and they drove there in the wagon on a warm May morning. Albert Morse was a thin, careful man with spectacles and an impressive mustache who listened to Martha's requirements with attentive intelligence and asked several sharp questions, and then said that what she was describing was not only legally achievable in Texas, but was a structure he had drawn up for 2 other couples in the county, and he was prepared to draft it for them. The agreement was clear. The farm, the land, the livestock, and the savings that Martha had accumulated remained legally hers. Any future earnings from the farm would be shared between them as specified. Harlan's wages from any external work and any property he brought to the marriage would be managed jointly. Either party's pre-existing assets were protected. It was not a document born of distrust, but of intelligence, and Morse seemed to appreciate the difference. They were married on the 14th of June, 1879, in the church in Redemption, with Preacher Davis officiating and Margaret Freeborn in the front pew wearing her best dress and making no particular effort to hide how pleased she was. Clara was flower girl and took the role with grave and beautiful seriousness, walking ahead of her mother up the aisle with a bunch of wildflowers she had picked herself that morning from the south meadow, bluebonnets and paintbrush, and a few yellow things that nobody could quite name. Martha wore the blue calico she had made from the length of fabric she had bought in December, which she had cut and sewn over the spring evenings while Harlan read on the other side of the kitchen table. It was not a wedding gown, but it was hers, and it was honest, and it was the right color for a June morning. Harlan wore his cleanest shirt and his good hat, and looked at her as she came down the aisle as if the world had narrowed to that single point, and she walked toward him and thought, "I am not afraid." Or she thought, more accurately, "I am afraid, but I am walking anyway, and maybe that is the braver thing." Preacher Davis said the words, and they said theirs, and when it was done and Harlan kissed her very gently, with a restraint that was entirely appropriate to the audience of Redemption's 400 souls and one 7-year-old girl who was watching with her flowers clutched tight and the most self-satisfied expression in the county, the church burst into a warmth of applause and well-wishing that felt genuine and good. Margaret hugged Martha for a long moment and said nothing, which said everything. Gerald Holt shook Harlan's hand and said he had known it since November, and Harlan said he expected he had. The celebration at the farm afterward was simple and joyful, with neighbors bringing dishes and someone producing a fiddle and Clara dancing with complete absence of self-consciousness until she fell asleep in her chair and had to be carried to bed. Martha sat on the porch in the evening light with Harlan beside her, close, his shoulder against hers, and the last of the guests drifting away down the road and the fireflies beginning to come up in the south meadow. "Are you happy?" he asked. She thought about it because she always thought about things. "Yes," she said, "actually comprehensively happy. It is a strange feeling. I had forgotten it was this uncomplicated." He put his arm around her, and she leaned against him, and they sat in the warm June night and watched the fireflies, and it was one of the finest hours she could remember. The first year of their marriage was full of all the adjustments that two self-sufficient people make when they decide to build a life together, which was to say there were moments of friction alongside the moments of joy, and both were real. Martha had run the farm her way for long enough that having a genuine partner in the decisions, not merely a hand who followed orders, required some negotiation. Harlan had his opinions, which were good ones, but they were not always her opinions, and she was not in the habit of deferring. They argued twice in the first month, once about the rotation of the fields, and once about the cost of a new plow versus repairing the old one. Both arguments were honest and relatively brief, and resolved without anyone going to bed cold or angry, because they were both people who valued directness over simmering. "You are not easy," Harlan told her after the second argument, with a tone that made it clear this was not a complaint. "You already knew that," she said. "I did," he said. "It is one of the things I love about you." She felt the word settle into her chest, solid and warm. "I love you," she said, because she had not said it explicitly yet, and she thought it was time. "I should have said that earlier. You have been telling me with everything you do, and I should have said it plainly." He looked at her with those gray eyes that had always been honest. "You have been telling me too," he said. "But plainly," she said. "I love you, Harlan Shelby." "I love you, Martha Shelby," he said. She had kept Callahan on the farm's papers, because it was the name the land was held under, but she used Shelby in town and in all their dealings, and it fit naturally, without effort. Clara, now 8 years old, used Harlan Shelby as a primary authority on all horse-related questions and a secondary authority on spelling, and she had begun calling him Pa in a casual, matter-of-fact way that had begun approximately 3 weeks after the wedding, and had apparently been a decision she made on her own without consulting anyone, and which nobody, least of all Harlan, was inclined to correct. The summer of 1879 brought the railroad news that the saloon had been predicting for years. The line was coming through the county, not through Redemption exactly, but through a depot town 3 miles east, which was close enough to change things considerably. Land prices were shifting. The cattle barons to the north were making noise about expanding south, filing claims on land they had no historic right to, which was the same story that had been playing out across the West for decades, the same injustice wearing a new set of boots. Harlan knew enough about it from his years on the cattle drives to explain what was happening, and Martha understood it through her own land documents with a clarity that was personally motivating. Together they attended 2 county meetings on the subject, Martha speaking at the second one with a precision that made several of the larger landowners uncomfortable, and earned her a quiet nod from the county commissioner, who was not in the pocket of the cattle interests. There was also, still, Dale Prout. Dale Prout had not come back to the farm, but he had been making noise in town about the Callahan land and its value now that the railroad was coming through the county, and there were rumors that he had connected himself with one of the cattle operation lawyers who specialized in finding legal angles. Harlan came home from town one afternoon with a narrow expression that Martha had learned meant he was genuinely concerned rather than merely annoyed. "Prout has a lawyer," Harlan said, "name of Whitaker, from Dallas. He has apparently filed some kind of claim questioning the original deed on the south acreage." Martha went very still. "On what grounds?" "Something about the original survey from when Thomas bought the land, claiming there is a discrepancy in the boundary markers." "There is no discrepancy," Martha said. "I have the survey, I have the original deed and the secondary deed and the payment records." "I know," he said. "Which is why we are going to see Albert Morse tomorrow morning." They drove to the county seat the next morning, and Albert Morse reviewed their documents and Whitaker's filing with the focused intensity of a man who took property law seriously. And when he was done, he looked up over his spectacles and said that Whitaker's filing was largely a nuisance document, not without any technical foothold, but very thin, and that he was confident he could beat it, but that Martha should also write to the state land office directly and request a confirmation of survey. Martha wrote the letter that afternoon. The legal process moved with the grinding slowness that legal processes have always moved with, and over the following months the claim was contested, documented, argued, and ultimately dismissed by the county judge, who had reviewed the original survey and found no material discrepancy, and noted in his ruling that frivolous claims against established landholders would not be entertained without significantly stronger evidence. Dale Prout left Redemption the following spring and was not seen again. Cyrus Prout, who had shown no interest in his brother's scheming, sent Martha a note of apology for the trouble, which she appreciated and acknowledged politely. The fall of 1879 brought another change, quieter and entirely welcome. Martha told Harlan in October, in the kitchen in the morning, with the straightforward manner she brought to everything. "We are going to have a baby," she said. He was at the stove pouring coffee, and he turned around and looked at her, and his face did something complicated and then resolved into an expression of such pure, unguarded happiness that she felt it in her chest like a struck bell. He set the coffee pot down carefully and came to her and took her face in his hands and looked at her. "Martha," he said. "Yes," she said. He kissed her not briefly, with all the warmth of a man who has waited a long time to have something to be profoundly grateful for, and she kissed him back and thought that she had been right about the fear moving to the back. It had never gone away entirely, but it had moved, and everything that had come forward in its place was better, was richer, was real in a way she had not let herself expect. Clara, when they told her, processed the information with characteristic efficiency. "Is it a boy or a girl?" she said. "We do not know yet," Martha said. "I would like a brother," Clara said. "There are enough girls at school." "Lucy Crane has a brother, and he is very annoying but also sometimes useful." Harlan looked like he was doing significant work not to laugh. "We will see what arrives," Martha said. What arrived in the middle of June 1880, on a warm night with the South Meadow in full summer and the fireflies going, was a boy. He was born with dark hair and a healthy set of lungs in Harlan's jaw, which was immediately observable, and he weighed, according to the doctor's estimate, a very respectable amount. He was also absolutely furious about the whole situation for approximately 20 minutes before deciding it was acceptable and going to sleep on Martha's chest. Harlan sat on the edge of the bed with his elbows on his knees and looked at them both with an expression that Martha filed away in her memory as one of the most important things she had ever seen on a human face. She was tired and sore and entirely happy. "Henry," she said. She had been thinking about names for months. "Henry," Harlan said, testing it. He looked at her. "Henry Shelby." "Henry Shelby," she agreed. Clara, who had been banished to Margaret Freeborn's house for the night and had arrived back at first light, appeared in the bedroom doorway still in her night braid with her wooden horse in her hand and looked at the baby with the expression of someone reassessing a major life decision. "He is very small," she said. "He will grow," Martha said. "He is red," Clara said. "All babies are," Harlan said. Clara came to the bed and looked more closely, and the baby, apparently sensing scrutiny, opened his eyes, which were dark and unfocused, and looked in her general direction. Clara went very quiet for a moment. "Hello, Henry," she said, in a small, careful voice entirely unlike her usual one. And that was that. Henry Shelby grew with the ranch, as babies do, pulling himself to standing against the paddock fence by the time he was 10 months old, which everyone agreed was entirely too ambitious and also entirely in keeping with who he was going to be. He had Harlan's steadiness and Martha's temper, which was a combination that was going to serve him well and would require some management in the interim. Clara, having decided that having a brother was acceptable, was a surprisingly gentle and consistent presence in his life, which Martha had not entirely predicted and was entirely moved by. Clara read to him before he could understand the words, and carried him around the yard while he grabbed at her braid with both hands, and was the first person to make him laugh, on a February afternoon when he was 8 months old, by making a face she had perfected for the purpose, and which sent him into a cascade of baby laughter that filled the kitchen and made Harlan come in from the yard to see what had happened. The farm grew in those years. They brought on more livestock, a second horse, then a third. They expanded the south field, using the more efficient rotation they had eventually agreed on, which Martha had been right about, and which Harlan had acknowledged without bitterness. They fenced a new meadow section in the spring of 1881. They hired a farmhand, an older man named Samuel Briggs, who had come out of Kansas with good references and an honest face, and he worked quietly and well and seemed grateful for the stability. Redemption itself was changing. The railroad depot 3 miles east had become a bustling stop, and the flow of goods had improved, and the town had grown a dress shop and a second doctor and a small hotel that served the people passing through on the cattle trade. The schoolhouse was expanded in 1881, which delighted Clara, who was 11 and already the kind of student who terrified her teachers with the precision of her questions. Harlan taught her to ride properly that summer, not just sitting on a gentle horse but actually riding, with reins and posture and the vocabulary of horsemanship. She took to it with the focused intensity she brought to everything she cared about, and within a month she was riding with a confidence that made Harlan quietly proud, and that she wore with the matter-of-fact ease of someone who simply expected to be competent. Martha watched this from the fence one afternoon, her arms on the top rail, Henry on her hip trying to get down and join whatever was happening, and she felt something she could only call abundance. Not the extravagant kind, not the showy kind, but the deep, quiet kind that comes from having more than you expected after expecting very little. Harlan came to stand beside her at the fence when Clara cantered off to the far end of the paddock, and Henry immediately made demanding sounds at him, and Harlan took him from Martha's arms and settled the boy on his own hip with the ease of someone who had been doing it for a year. "She is going to be dangerous on horseback by fall," Harlan said. "She is going to be dangerous on horseback by next month," Martha said. They watched Clara bring the horse around the turn, her braid flying, her face alight. "Harlan," Martha said. He said, "I want to tell you something." "All right," he said. She turned and looked at him, this man with the gray eyes and the child on his hip and the years of quiet mornings between them. "I was wrong," she said. "On Christmas night, When I said grief and fear amounted to the same thing as not caring, they do not. You were right about that. He looked at her. And I want you to know, she said, that the fact that I was frightened and I did it anyway is the best thing I have ever done. Beside her, she nodded at Clara, and him. She indicated Henry, who was currently trying to put a fistful of Harlan's shirt collar in his mouth. It is the best decision of my life. He looked at her for a long moment, and then he shifted Henry to his other hip and reached over and put his free hand against the side of her face, and she leaned into it, the way she had learned to lean into the things that were good and solid without requiring herself to be afraid of losing them. I know what I said that Christmas night was presumptuous, he said. Enormously, she agreed. I would say it again, he said. I know, she said. I am glad you did. Clara brought the horse around in a triumphant circle and leaned down to pat the animal's neck with a proud expression. And Henry yelled something that was not yet a word, but had the intention of one. And Martha laughed. And Harlan watched her laugh with the look he always had when she did, as if it were a thing he could not quite get accustomed to the privilege of witnessing. By the spring of 1882, redemption had grown enough that it was acquiring a real civic identity, with an elected town council and a newspaper that was more substantial than Gerald Holt's newsletter, though Gerald remained an enthusiastic contributor. The injustice of the cattle baron land grabbing had continued to be a serious issue throughout the region, and several families in the county had lost their homesteads to legal maneuvers that were technically lawful and morally indefensible. Martha and Harlan had helped two of those families, the Mortons and the Caskies, navigate their legal options, connecting them with Albert Morse and sitting through the county meetings with them, and making sure their voices were part of the record. It was not enough to fix the larger system, which was broken in ways that no single county could address, but it was what they could do, and they did it. Henry, at 2 years old, was a force of nature in a very small package. He walked early, talked early, climbed everything that would hold him and several things that would not, and had inherited Martha's green eyes and Harlan's disinclination to see obstacles as permanent. Clara had given up trying to keep him out of her room and had instead taught him a series of impressive hand signals that they used to communicate, which she claimed was practical, and which Martha suspected was simply because Clara had decided that if her brother was going to be everywhere, he might as well be useful. In the fall of that year, Martha discovered she was expecting again, which she told Harlan the same way she had told him the first time, directly in the kitchen in the morning. This time he did not just stand there with the coffee pot. He crossed the kitchen and put his arms around her without saying anything for a moment, and she rested her face against his shoulder and felt the steadiness of him. Happy, she said. More than I know how to say, he said. You? Yes, she said, still a little frightened. Yes, he said, still together. Together, she agreed. The second baby was a girl, born in April of 1883, with red lights in her hair like the evening sun, and lungs every bit as enthusiastic as Henry's had been. They named her Rose, for no reason more complicated than that Martha had always loved the word, and Harlan thought it suited her from the moment he saw her. Henry, who was 3, inspected the new arrival with concentrated suspicion for approximately 2 days, and then came to a decision Martha could not quite identify. And from that point forward was protective of Rose in the specific way of a boy who has decided something is his responsibility, which was, she thought, going to produce some interesting years. Clara, who was 13, held Rose with the precision and care of someone who had been practicing with Henry for 3 years and had thoughts about doing it correctly, and told Harlan at the supper table that Rose was going to need to know how to ride by the time she was 5, which was non-negotiable. Agreed, Harlan said. Martha, Clara said, because she called Martha by her name when she wanted to be taken seriously, which Martha respected. Do you agree? I agree that your sister is going to ride, Martha said, and I trust you to teach her well. Clara nodded with satisfaction and applied herself to her supper. The farm by 1884 was a genuinely thriving operation, with expanded wheat fields and a modest but successful kitchen garden that Martha had developed into a supply for two of the restaurants that had opened in Redemption and in the depot town to the east. Samuel Briggs had become an indispensable part of the enterprise, and they had added a second hand, a young man named Pete Wainwright who was earnest and hard-working and learning quickly. The legal agreement that Albert Morse had drawn up before the wedding had protected everything that needed protecting, and Martha had added to it over the years with a series of provisions that reflected the growth of what they had built. Harlan was 40 now, and the sun and the years had settled into his face in a way that Martha found entirely beautiful, though she told him so rarely enough that he still looked surprised when she said it, which she preferred to him taking it for granted. She was 35, and her chestnut hair had begun to have threads of silver near the temples, which she did not bother to disguise because she had earned them, every one. They rode together, just the two of them, on a Saturday in the early spring of 1885, out to the South Meadow where the bluebonnets were just beginning. It was a tradition that had started accidentally in the second year of their marriage, when they had both been on horseback for separate reasons and ended up at the meadow at the same time, and it had become a thing they did when they could, without making a production of it. They stopped at the edge of the bluebonnets and sat their horses side by side and looked at the wide, flat Texas horizon, where the sky was doing something spectacular with the afternoon light. "Margaret Freeborn is going to retire from her house and go live with her niece in Austin," Martha said. "I heard," he said. "Are you sad about it?" "A little," she said honestly. "She is one of my oldest friends. But she is tired and her niece will look after her well." She paused. "She told me last week that she was right about you." Harlan smiled, looking at the horizon. "What did you say?" "I said she was usually right about things," Martha said, "and that this was no exception." "High praise from Martha Shelby," he said. "From both of us, actually," she said. "She was right, and so were you." He looked over at her. The evening light was doing something to the bluebonnets below them, turning them from blue to purple, and the horses were still, and the air smelled of grass and early spring and something that had no name. "About what in particular?" he said. "About names your reason and I will fix it," she said. "I was so certain that grief was an argument, that it was a wall, but you were right that it was fear, and fear can be lived through. It does not go away, but it does not have to be the last word." He moved his horse a step closer to hers, close enough that their knees were nearly touching. "The last word," he said, "is this." He leaned over and kissed her, there at the edge of the bluebonnet meadow, in the evening light of the Texas spring, 35 and 40 and entirely sure, both of them, of the particular rightness of where they had ended up. She kissed him back, and then she laughed, softly, for the same reason she had laughed that Christmas night when he had first said it, because some things were both serious and joyful at the same time, and she had learned in these years that the combination was not a contradiction. They rode back through the meadow in the fading light, unhurried, with the farm ahead of them, lit from the kitchen window by the lamp Clara had put on, because Clara was 15 now and ran the kitchen on Saturday evenings with the composed authority of a girl who had watched her mother do it and decided she could too. Through the window Martha could see the shape of Henry at the table, and the lamp, and the warm yellow light of the life she had built. She thought of the woman she had been on the day of Thomas's funeral, standing at the graveside with her back straight and her eyes dry, certain that the most honest thing she could do for herself was close every door. She thought of how absolute that certainty had felt, how righteous and how complete. She thought of a man riding in from the north on a cold November day on a big roan horse, pulling off his hat in her yard with good manners and honest eyes, and asking for work. She thought of Christmas night and a lamp on a table and a question that had seemed, at the time, presumptuous beyond imagining. "Name your reason, and I will fix it." She had named them. He had fixed what could be fixed, And the things that could not be fixed, the irreducible vulnerability of loving people in a world that did not guarantee their staying, she had lived with those and was living with them still, and they had not undone her. They had made her more, in the way that only the real things do. She turned in the saddle and looked at Harlan Shelby riding beside her, and he was looking at her already, and she thought, This is the right thing. This was worth the fear and the grief and the long, careful walk toward something I had decided I did not want. Race you to the gate, she said. His face broke into a full, unguarded grin, the one she had been the first person to see, and that still struck her as one of the finest things in West Texas. Martha Shelby, he said, you are on a garden horse and I am on copper. Yes, she said. I know, race me anyway. She put her heels to her mare, and the mare leaped forward into the golden evening, and behind her she heard him laugh, wide and free, and then the thunder of Copper's hooves as he came after her, and she leaned over her horse's neck and rode for the gate of the farm that was hers and the life that was theirs and the kitchen window that glowed warm and certain in the early dark. She won. She won because Harlan let her, and she knew it, and he knew she knew it, and neither of them said a word about it. Clara had supper on the table. Henry was telling Rose a story about a horse that was almost certainly not true, but which Rose was receiving with total credulity. Samuel Briggs had left for the evening. Pete Wainwright had fixed the gate hinge before he went, which Martha noticed and appreciated. They sat down together, all five of them, around the table in the kitchen of the Callahan Shelby farm, in the town of Redemption, Texas, in the year 1885, with the spring coming in the meadow outside and the wheat in the ground, and the horses settled in the paddock and Margaret Freeborn's blessing in the air around them. And Clara said grace in the clear, steady voice of a girl who would grow into a formidable woman. And Henry said amen 3 words before she was finished, which he always did. And Rose laughed at him, which she always did. And Martha and Harlan looked at each other across the table briefly, with everything that did not require words, and then they ate. It was, in all the ways that matter, exactly enough, more than enough. It was the thing that had been on the other side of the wall, waiting with the patience of something that knows it is true. It was the reason that fear, in the end, no matter how legitimate and how deeply felt, was not the whole story. It never is. The horses stood in the paddock in the soft April night, Copper among them, red and large and perfectly content, and the lamp burned in the kitchen window, and the wheat was coming up green in the south field. And inside the farmhouse that Martha Callahan had held and fought for and opened, finally, to the full possibility of living, her family sat around a table in the light, and the world outside was wide and wild and full of everything that a life, chosen with courage and stubbornness, and an unwillingness to let fear have the final word, could hold. Harlan caught her eye again over the bread basket, and she saw in his face the same thing she felt, the same quiet, comprehensive certainty, and she passed him the bread, and Henry started the story about the horse again, louder this time, because if once was good, louder was better, and Rose was delighted. And Clara told him he was making things up, and he said he was not. And Martha let the noise and the warmth and the lamplight settle over her like the best kind of weight. The kind that tells you exactly where you are. She was home. She had always been good at standing on her own, and she remained so. But this was the thing she had not known how to say on Christmas night, the thing that had taken a full winter and a spring and a handful of years, and a man with steady gray eyes and infinite patience to learn. Standing on your own and choosing someone to stand beside you were not the same choice, and the second one did not diminish the first. It multiplied it. Outside, the Texas night stretched on toward its wide horizon, and in the farmhouse in Redemption the lamp burned, and the Shelby family was all present, accounted for, and entirely, irreversibly, joyfully home.